Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Zeit zu Reden International, the English edition of Zeit zu Reden. A very warm welcome from our team, Ido Arad, Heiko Kassian, and myself. This is our first event at Boom, which is why I want to take the opportunity to introduce a little bit what we are doing at Zeit zu Reden. It's an initiative that we started more than 1 year ago to bring people together from different backgrounds and help them, educate them, help them, enable them to have a frank discussion on sensitive issues in Germany, especially any topics that are connected to Palestine and Israel, as we felt that this is highly missing in the discourse, in this rather silenced public discourse that we are having in Germany. So what we're doing is we're having panel discussions every month at Spoor Initiative in Neukölln. We bring experts, intellectuals, journalists, scholars to our panels to discuss different issues. We've done a panel on Staatsräson, the German media in Gaza, police violence, German memory culture, anti-Muslim racism, the right to resist, different kinds of things. On the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, we did a panel. And on Thursday, we just had an international panel on genocide. And our speaker of tonight, Mouin Rabbani, was one of the guests there discussing it with Diana Butu and Michael Sfard. You can watch all these panels online on our YouTube channel at Zeit zu Reden. If you want to know more about Zeit zu Reden, you can watch, or you can go to our new website, zeitzureden.org, where you can even sign up for our newsletter, and you can join us on Instagram as well. So, first time at Boom, thank you very much for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here, it's an honor to be here. And tonight is going to be a lecture which is different. And the subject, the topic that we're going to talk about is Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian National Movement. And as this is all about Palestinians, it should be Palestinians who have the discussion and who have the evening to make them feel it's theirs. And this is why I have my colleague Khaled and Mahmoud, who's going to moderate the evening. It's a pleasure to have him here. He's a legal trainee right now at the Berlin Court of Appeal. He did his PhD at the University of Potsdam. And he is managing editor of the Völkerrechtsblog, which is an international law blog. So I hope that everybody here has a very enlightening evening. I'm sure about that. And I hand over to Khaled. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to tonight's lecture. It's a great honor for me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin Rabbani is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestine, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has served as Senior Political Affairs Officer in the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, as Head of Middle East with the Marty Atisari Peace Foundation, as Senior Middle East Analyst and Special Advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group, and as a researcher with Al-Haq. Mouin Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya. He's also an editor of the Middle East Report, a senior non-resident fellow of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs Center, and a non-resident fellow with both the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and Democracy for the Arab World Now. Mouin Rabbani has extensively written on Middle East issues for leading print, broadcast, and digital media around the world. He is the author of numerous articles and opinion pieces, as well as co-author and editor of several books. His forthcoming book, Gaza Apocalypse, Causes and Consequences, will be published soon. As someone who's both Palestinian and Tunisian, this discussion carries deep personal meaning for me. The story of the Palestinian National Movement is not only political history. It's a story of exile, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for justice, freedom, and dignity. For Tunisians, this connection has a special significance. After the PLO was forced to leave Beirut In 1982, Tunisia became its home in exile. For more than a decade, Tunis was the center of Palestinian political life. That period reminds us that the Palestinian struggle has always been part of a broader Arab story, one of shared solidarity and common aspirations for justice. With Mouin Rabbani's deep expertise and experience, we will explore that history, its achievements, its setbacks, and the questions it poses for the future of the Palestinian National Movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Allow me to begin by extending my thanks and appreciation to Zeit, to Reden, and especially to Haj, to Ido, and to Kristen for the wonderful reception in Berlin and for organizing several events here. And Khaled, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'll be speaking tonight about the Palestinian National Movement, an analysis of its origins, its development, and its future prospects. And although my focus will be on the period after 1948, by way of introduction, I will be discussing the prior period as well, just by way of background. So by way of introduction, the emergence of a national movement is of course closely related to the development of a distinctly national, in this case, Palestinian identity. It is in this respect worth recalling that identity is a dynamic, multidimensional, and typically contextual phenomenon that is almost never inevitable. Groups and individuals don't have fixed, static identities because they typically change and adapt over time and space. Identity is furthermore not exclusively self-generated, but also exists and is formed in the eye of the beholder. In the words of Israeli scholars Baruch Kimmerling and Joel Migdal, writing in their book Palestinians, The Making of a People, and now I'm quoting, "The making of a people is not a volcanic experience coming out of a singular, critical moment in which forces converge to create a gigantic eruption. It is rather a long process with all sorts of reversals and changes of direction, marked by continuing struggle against others, particularly powerful others, and internal struggles among contending groups. From all those struggles emerge a set of dominant myths, practices, institutions, goals, and even social divisions that enable otherwise disparate individuals and groups to think of themselves as a whole, set off from other peoples. Subsequently, that self-awareness can wax and wane. It can take on new boundaries, excluding some who had been included, and including previously shunned groups, and it can even disappear altogether," end quote. In their book, Kimmerling and Migdal trace the roots of Palestinian national consciousness to the widespread revolt that erupted in 1834 against the Egyptian occupation of what was then still Ottoman Palestine. It's an interesting perspective because it predates the conflict with Zionism by more than half a century. It was, however, the emergence of Zionism and its project to transform what was an overwhelmingly Arab territory into an exclusivist Jewish state that saw a distinctly Palestinian nationalism take precedence over the available alternatives. The Palestinian historian Mohammed Mosleh, in his book The Origins of Palestinian Nationalism, focuses on the final decades of Ottoman rule and the period immediately after the First World War. Mosleh notes that the main alternatives to Palestinian nationalism, namely Ottomanism and Arabism, were unable to fulfill Palestinian political aspirations or successfully address their priorities, and thereby turbocharged the development of a distinctly Palestinian national movement. Muslih argues that Ottomanism was eclipsed not on account of the empire's defeat and collapse during the Great War, but already in the decades before it, because the Sublime Porte failed to nip the Zionist project to colonize Palestine in the bud. In other words, it failed seen from the perspective of the Palestinian confrontation with Zionism, it failed before the First World War rather than as a result of it. Arabism, for its part, fell victim to a combination, this is according to Muslih, fell victim to a combination of internal and external challenges. On the one hand, different and often incompatible local priorities consistently trumped the efforts to establish a common agenda among Arabism's advocates. At the same time, the British and French successfully destroyed the effort immediately after the Ottoman defeat to establish a united, independent, sovereign Arab state in the empire's former Arab provinces, essentially Greater Syria and Iraq, that would have incorporated Palestine. Those who argued that Palestinians should take the lead in achieving their own salvation thus won the argument, not so much through persuasion, but because the broader regional alternatives proposed to confront and defeat Zionism were rendered impractical or impotent. This was a message that was already being promoted in Palestine in various ways, whether through the influential newspaper Philistine, established in 1911, or through the Muslim Christian Association, MCA, a political society whose various chapters coalesced into the Palestine Arab Congress in 1919, or a slew of other similar initiatives. The Palestine Arab Congress initially promoted unity with Syria. Where am I? Yes, the Palestine Arab Congress initially promoted unity with Syria, but by its second year was demanding the establishment of a national government in and for Palestine and advocating for the organization of a Palestinian Arab National Movement, in other words, a distinct one. With the British mandate separating Palestine from the rest of Greater Syria, with the Zionist movement determined to transform the lands within its boundaries into a Jewish state, and the Arab population increasingly subordinating its various differences to the urgency of confronting Zionism, a distinctly Palestinian national identity further solidified. It was Arab, yet distinctly Palestinian, and in many cases also Muslim or Christian, yet distinctly Palestinian. The 1936-1939 Arab rebellion in Palestine, which began with a general strike throughout Palestine from April to October 1936, at the time the longest in recorded history for those still searching for a Palestinian Gandhi, is most likely the event that solidified Palestinian national identity and consciousness beyond the point of no return. Had this not been the case, it would stand to reason that the Nakba, or catastrophe, of 1948 would have resulted in not only the dispersal, but also the disintegration and disappearance of the Palestinians as a people. After all, the Nakba saw Palestine erased from the map, its society shattered, and more than 75% of the Arab population in the territory that became Israel transformed into stateless refugees. Yet this is not what happened. To be sure, the national movement that emerged during the British Mandate and reached its zenith during the 1936 rebellion was largely decimated by rebellion's end in 1939. It was thereafter, and largely because of its losses during the 1930s, incapable of preventing the Nakba and effectively destroyed by it. After 1948, Palestinian activists initially flocked to regional or international movements like the Baathists, the Communists, or the Muslim Brotherhood. This was, I think, a natural response, seeking power in numbers, if you will. but also hoping to transform a regional order that had so miserably failed the Palestinians and failed to prevent the Nakba. The trend is exemplified by George Habash, who in 1952 led the foundation of the movement of Arab nationalists, seeking to replace existing governments with a regional alliance of revolutionary pan-Arab polities, or in his ideal, one. Yet already by the late 1950s, several members of these various groups, disenchanted with these groups' achievements, would coalesce to form the nucleus of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, better known by its reverse Arab acronym, Fatah. This was, it bears recollection, within a mere decade of the Nakba. Habash, whose pan-Arab movement over the years increasingly aligned with Abdel Nasser's Egypt, would after the 1967 defeat promote its transformation into separate, openly Marxist national chapters. Its Palestinian successor came to be known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, which in turn, in 1969, spawned from within its ranks the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or DFLP. The development of distinctly Palestinian nationalist movements should be seen against the background of several key developments during the 1950s and 1960s. Among the most important, in my view, are the Algerian Revolution, which triumphed in 1962 and which demonstrated that a people could achieve its national aspirations independently of a united Arab campaign. Secondly, the dissolution of the United Arab Republic, UAR, which from 1958 to 1961 unified Egypt and Syria into a single polity. The UAR proved to be the failed apex rather than the commencement of a process uniting Arab states that had removed the shackles of Franco-British colonialism and imperialism. Awaiting Arab unity to liberate Palestine, in other words, was therefore no longer an option, rather than Iraq joining Egypt and Syria and the United Arab Republic. Its two components, Egypt and Syria, split apart. Third, regional movements such as the Baathists, the Communists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other Islamist movements appeared more often than not preoccupied with achieving and maintaining power and with conflict with their domestic rivals rather than implementing a regional project that encompassed Palestine. But most importantly, without a doubt, the shattering defeat of June 1967 was experienced as a demonstration of the military incompetence and political bankruptcy of the existing Arab order, of its Republican nationalists and conservative monarchists alike, but particularly of those espousing the pan-Arabism that many Palestinians had since 1948 looked to for salvation. The vacuum established by the 1967 defeat also opened up an opportunity for the nationalist guerrilla movement to erupt onto the regional and international stage. And here we come to, I think, the first key chapter in the contemporary Palestinian national movement, and that is the Jordanian phase, if you will, of the national movement from 1967 to 1970, and through which these movements were able to seize control of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Just to backtrack, the Palestine Liberation Organization had been established in 1964, not so much as a Palestinian initiative, but at the initiative of the Arab League. And the idea behind it was not to promote Palestinian militancy, but rather to contain it so that it did not present a threat to Arab strategic policies. And it was formed in 1964 with Ahmed Shaqiri as its first head of executive committee. And he was known as someone who was very close to the Egyptian leader, Abdel Nasser, and essentially led the PLO in a direction that functioned as a surrogate for Egyptian regional policy. After 1967, that became no longer tenable, and you had the growing involvement and influence of Fatah, of the PFLP, of other Palestinian guerrilla movements within the PLO, and in 1968, 1969, they were able to seize absolute control of it. They elevated a Fatah leader, Yasser Arafat, to be chairman of the executive committee of the PLO, and they were able to set up essentially a state within a state in Jordan, focused in the Jordan Valley, from which they launched a prolonged guerrilla campaign against Israel, while at the same time the PLO factions were also able to seize control of the refugee camps, particularly in southern Lebanon, but Lebanon as a whole. Now, during this phase, let me just backtrack a moment and say many of you may have been exposed to the Zionist propaganda that actually the whole concept of Palestine was really a conspiracy hatched by the KGB, which in 1964 had bought this trainee from the Soviet Union, Yasser Arafat, who had been indoctrinated in Moscow or somewhere else in the Soviet Union, and he invented the term Palestine, and he invented the Palestinian flag, and he invented all these other things. Well, Yasser Arafat was absent from the founding conference of the PLO in 1964, and he only became active in the PLO, the Fatah movement as a whole, after 1967, and of course only became its leader in, I think it was in February of 1969. Now, the other question to ask is, why did Palestinian nationalism not seek to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after 1948? As you may recall, the partition resolution of November 1947 gave the proposed Jewish state approximately 56% of the territory of mandatory Palestine, and the prospective Arab state about 40%. But on account of long-standing collusion between the Zionist movement and the Hashemite leadership of what was then Transjordan, a concerted, successful effort was made to prevent the establishment of an independent Arab state in the West Bank, and that territory was incorporated into what became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and annexed, an annexation that was recognized by only Britain and Palestine. And this laid the basis for a long-running rivalry after 1967 between the PLO on the one hand and the Hashemite monarchy on the other, for the national representation of the Palestinian people. But just as importantly, in the aftermath of the Nakba, the priority for Palestinians, and of course for Palestinian nationalism, was to undo the impact of the Nakba. In other words, to ensure the right of return of the dispossessed Palestinians to their original homes, rather than the idea of establishing an independent Palestinian entity. And to this end, the political program of the PLO during the Jordanian period, such as it was very much focused on dismantling the State of Israel, on defeating it through prolonged guerrilla warfare, armed struggle, a concept that was then very popular in much of the Third World, in Cuba and Vietnam, in the aftermath of Algeria, and so on. And negotiations with Israel, any kind of diplomatic resolution with Israel was simply not on the agenda. The political program focused on the total liberation of Palestine. This also served the purpose of holding all the disparate Palestinian factions together who had quite different political programs. So Fatah, for example, was a purely nationalist movement. Internally, it functioned as an ideological supermarket. Its members, its cadres, were communists, were nationalists, were Islamists, were liberals, were conservatives, and the only requirement it had of its members was that they renounce any previous organizational affiliation that they had. And it functioned almost as, let's call it, as a broad-based united front for Palestinian nationalists. The PFLP and the DFLP, by contrast, were much more ideological organization with a clearly Marxist orientation, and their programs were much more regional. They continued to believe in the principle that the liberation of Palestine required as a prerequisite the overthrow of the reactionary Arab regimes tied to Western imperialism, and as they would put it, and that without such a regional transformation, Palestine could not be liberated because the nationalist movement would continually be sabotaged by Arab reaction, in the phrase of the time. And this ultimately led to the crisis in Jordan in 1970, known as Black September, where the Fatah movement sought a kind of dual power within Jordan, where it believed it could operate and implement its program of armed struggle and national liberation from within Jordanian territory without a confrontation with the Jordanian monarchy. The leftist factions, the PFLP and the DFLP primarily, adopted a program of confrontation, if you will, with the Jordanian monarchy, and believed that it was important to overthrow the monarchy in order to be able to implement the national program. And it was within this context, and of course, also the desire of both the monarchy of Israel and of the United States and of conservative regional regimes to see the PLO defeated within Jordan, that the monarchy was able to successfully unleash its attack on Palestinian forces in Lebanon in September 1970 and expel them from the country by the end of 1971. And this only heightened the rivalry between the PLO and the Jordanian monarchy for representation of the Palestinian people, something that ultimately would not be resolved until the height of the First Intifada in August 1988. Now the next, and after that, of course, the PLO established its headquarters once again in exile in the Lebanese capital of Beirut. You know, a very different environment, of course, than that of Jordan, and in the course of which it was increasingly drawn into Lebanese domestic politics, where on the one hand it served as a foil for certain groups in Lebanon who hoped to use opposition to the Palestinian presence as a mechanism through which to retain and consolidate their power within the Lebanese state. And others saw the Palestinian presence as a mechanism through which they could challenge the existing arrangements of the Lebanese state and transform them. But before we get to the Lebanese Civil War, the next major development was the 1973 October War, in which Egypt and Syria jointly launched a surprise offensive seeking to liberate their territories that had been occupied by Israel in 1967. And this formed a fundamental turning point in the view of the Palestinian leadership, because it laid the basis for a diplomatic resolution of what was then commonly known as the Arab-Israeli conflict. In other words, at the conclusion of the October War, and despite the initial successes by Arab military force, it became clear to the Palestinian leadership that there was going to be some kind of diplomatic arrangement between the Arab states, or at least key Arab states, and Israel. And that the Arab program to dismantle the state of Israel and to support the total liberation of Palestine was really no longer on the agenda. And this basically put Palestinian leaders before a dilemma. They could either try to accommodate to these changing winds by adopting a different strategy themselves, or they could continue challenging it on the basis of seeking to achieve a regional transformation. And it's in this context that we begin to see the roots of the support of important elements of the Palestinian leadership for what became known as the two-state settlement. So in 1974, for example, at the meeting of the Palestinian National Council, the PLO's parliament in exile, we see the adoption of what was known as a transitional program, or the 10-point program, and which called for the establishment, I believe the term used was a fighting national authority on any part of Palestine that was liberated from Israeli rule. What it essentially meant, if you read between the lines, was an acceptance by those who supported that program of a two-state settlement. And this became even more formalized in 1976 when Egypt, which was that year sitting on the UN Security Council, proposed a draft resolution that was supported by the PLO that openly called for a two-state settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if I can use that term, and which was vetoed by both the United States and Britain. And Coulter Lauwerse, who has done his doctorate on this topic, has written a fascinating article on kind of the diplomatic maneuvers that were being conducted at the time. By this time also, of course, the Lebanese civil war had erupted, and Palestinian energies were increasingly consumed by their participation in the domestic Lebanese conflict. It's, you know, in some of the revisionist history of the Lebanese civil war, it's proposed that it was in fact the Palestinians who initiated the war. I think at one level you can say that the PLO's very presence in Lebanon served as a catalyst for the civil war, because as I was explaining earlier, you had important sectors of the Lebanese political elite using that presence to kind of mobilize their own forces in order to retain and consolidate power or change the equation in Lebanon. But what we know now is that the key elements of the Palestinian leadership, Fatah, the PFLP, and others, tried very hard to remain out of it. And there were others, minor actors, such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, which was very, ironically, very closely tied to Syria, which was very enthusiastic to get involved. But in the end, it was unavoidable. And from the mid-70s until 1982, the Palestinian National Movement was very much focused on developments within Lebanon on the one hand, and on the broader diplomatic changes within the region on the other. And the most important of which, of course, was the Egyptian-Israeli diplomatic process that resulted in the 1977 Camp David meeting and ultimately the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Now, the most important impact of Egyptian-Israeli peace is that it removed the most powerful Arab military force from the Arab-Israeli equation. And it laid the basis for Israel's ability in 1982 to invade Lebanon. I think there's pretty much a consensus that if Israel did not enjoy peace on its southern border with Egypt, it would never have seriously considered launching a full-scale invasion of Lebanon as it did in 1982. The purpose, for those of you who remember this phase of history, Israel promoted its invasion of Lebanon as Operation Peace for Galilee. In fact, the operation's real name was Operation Big Pines, and it was part of an entire regional strategy in which Israel would seize Beirut, eliminate the PLO and the Palestinian leadership, install a collaborationist government in Beirut, which in turn would expel the Palestinian population of Lebanon to Jordan, create the conditions for the transformation of Jordan into a Palestinian republic, and this was somehow supposed to lay the basis for the formal Israeli annexation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, it didn't quite work out that way because for almost 2 months, the Israelis, despite their overwhelming force and firepower, were unable to enter West Beirut and to seize it and to defeat the Palestinians there. And in the end, the Palestinians were able to depart Lebanon through a negotiated exit, and they went mostly in exile to Tunis and also to Damascus. Now, by this time also, I think the rivalry between the PLO and the Hashemite monarchy had been largely resolved because it was very much focused in the West Bank. And in 1976, municipal elections were organized in the West Bank, and Palestinian nationalist forces overwhelmingly won. And the traditional pro-Hashemite candidates lost despite being strongly supported by Israel, including, for example, the expulsion of several municipal candidates and so on. And the other main effect of the 1982 invasion is that the Palestinian National Movement in exile began to invest much more significantly into building up its organizations in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I mean, they had, from the very outset, formed out armed cells and carried out attacks and so on. But they had never really invested in building up a grassroots, organized, popular presence in the same way that they had at the camps in exile. That had been done mainly by the communists and the Islamists, neither of which were constituent members of the PLO. But what we see is that beginning in 1982, they began to do so much more intensively. And when the First Intifada erupted in 1987, it wasn't a planned uprising, but because so much preparatory work had been done, it became very easy for the Palestinian organizations within the occupied territories to expand and to sustain it. Now, the impact of the First Intifada was twofold as far as our discussion this evening is concerned. On the one hand, it made clear to the Israelis that the status quo was untenable. At the same time, it led to the rise of new forces in Palestinian politics, particularly Hamas. We had the formation already of Islamic Jihad in the 1980s, and Islamic Jihad mainly consisted of disaffected members of the Muslim Brotherhood who were no longer prepared to tolerate the passivity and quiescence of the Muslim Brotherhood and wanted to form an organization that would be engaged in direct action against the Israeli occupation, joined by members primarily of Fatah, who were similarly no longer invested in their previous movement because it seemed to have changed direction from one of armed confrontation with Israel and the occupation to one of diplomatic accommodation. So when the Intifada erupted in 1987, the Muslim Brotherhood was faced with a dilemma. If it continued its quiescence, if it continued avoiding confrontation with the occupation, it would see its members leave for either the Islamic Jihad or Fatah or the other organizations. But if it joined the uprising, it risked being demolished by the Israelis. And so what it did is it established Hamas as kind of an experiment in plausible deniability. If it succeeded, the Muslim Brotherhood would take responsibility for it. And if it failed, it could say, well, these are rogue elements, you know, they're now being held responsible for their action. Well, of course, it was a very successful experiment. And by the end of the Intifada, Hamas had grown to an extent that it was already in certain areas beginning to rival the influence of Fatah and the PFLP. And I now want to jump forward to 2006 and the Palestinian legislative elections that were held that were held after the removal of Yasser Arafat from the scene. And many of you will remember that Hamas's victory in that election was explained as a result of popular opposition to corruption of the Palestinian Authority, of mismanagement, of malfeasance, and so on. And while those were issues, they were very secondary. I've always felt that the key component, the key element of the rise and success of Hamas had less to do with issues like corruption and everything to do with the failure of the PLO, of the Fatah leadership, to achieve its political program. So imagine, if you will, for a second, that the Oslo agreements had concluded with the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem, and that the Fatah election campaign had been led from a headquarters in East Jerusalem. If Fatah would have been 10 times as corrupt, it would have still won those elections hands down, because the fundamental issue was the failure of the PLO, and of Fatah in particular, to achieve its political program that created the space for others to try to seek the same objective through different means. And here we get back to Oslo, because of course in September 1993, Israel and the PLO signed this Declaration of Principles. And it was never about implementing a two-state settlement. For those of you who haven't read the Oslo agreements, it's all of 3 or 4 pages, on the whole written in plain English. And I would encourage all of you to read it. It never mentions occupation. It never mentions self-determination. It never mentions statehood. And it's basically the mechanism through which Israel sought to rearrange and perpetuate its control over the Palestinians, to perpetuate its occupation rather than to end the occupation and relinquish its control of the occupied territories. Well, then the obvious question is, why did the Palestinian leadership, or at least a core element of the Palestinian leadership, accept and sign this agreement? Well, part of the reason is its rivalry with Hamas, and the other part is its growing irrelevance, particularly in the wake of the 1990-1991 Kuwait crisis, when it was seen to be siding with Iraq against the regional and international coalition, and became increasingly marginalized, starved of funds, was seen in many ways as having become increasingly irrelevant, and for that PLO leadership, Oslo was its ticket to renewed international relevance. It was once again in the very center of regional and international attention. The price it paid for that, of course, we're still seeing today, because there was no agreed strategic objective of this agreement. It was never meant to result in a Palestinian state of any sort. And in the end, it collapsed in July 2000 with the, just looking at the time, it collapsed at the failed Camp David summit in 2000, which directly led to the Second Intifada, when it became clear that the maximum Israel was prepared to relinquish was far below the minimum that any legitimate Palestinian leadership could accept. And it is in this context that I remain convinced, I have absolutely no doubt, that Yasser Arafat did not die a natural death, that he was forcibly removed from the scene to make way for Mahmoud Abbas, who was seen as, certainly by the Americans, as someone who could serve as a reliable partner for the Israelis. Problem is that by the time Abbas consolidated his rule over the Palestinian National Movement, Israel no longer had a need for a partner. The value of Oslo for Israel was that it needed a Palestinian leader to sign on the dotted line. You know, I relinquish this, I relinquish that, I give you this, I give you that. At the end of the day, when push came to shove, Yasser Arafat was unprepared to play that role. Abbas, I believe, was prepared to play that role. I mean, we have the proof in a 1995 draft agreement he signed with Yossi Benin. But by the time he was in power, Israel no longer had any need for such a partner, because with its crushing of the Second Intifada, it was convinced it could unilaterally resolve the question of Palestine on its own terms. And it is in this context also that we now look at what happened in the years after. You have the Schism of 2007, where after the 2006 elections, you had on the one hand a Fatah movement that had been in charge of the Palestinian National Movement for about 4 decades, and didn't feel that losing one election should make any difference. In other words, that nothing should change, and was unprepared to allow the winners of that election, Hamas, to actually assume the rightful role in the Palestinian Authority. And on the other hand, you had a Hamas movement that basically felt that winning one election meant that everything that preceded it was irrelevant. And then, of course, you had the Israelis and the Europeans and the Americans determined to prevent Hamas from exercising any power or influence within the Palestinian National Movement. And you've probably all heard of the quartet conditions and so on. And the crisis erupted in 2007, where under the leadership of Mohammed Dahlan, with the support of the Americans, a coup was being planned in the Gaza Strip, and it's been written about extensively. And Hamas essentially launched a preemptive coup, seized power in the Gaza Strip, and has ruled it hegemonically ever since. So in that context, you now have a formal schism in the Palestinian National Movement, because Hamas and Islamic Jihad had never been part of the PLO. They did not participate in national decision-making. There was, during the Second Intifada, an informal body called the Nationalist and Islamic Forces, in which representatives of all the PLO factions and the non-PLO factions would meet and discuss and debate and reach decisions, but it never achieved the status of a formal decision-making body. After the 2006 elections, and particularly after the 2007 schism, there were multiple agreements reached about the way forward. And many of them were focused on seeking to incorporate Hamas and Islamic Jihad into the PLO through first what was known as a temporary leadership committee, then leading to their full integration. But the insurmountable obstacle in each of these agreements had always proven to be Mahmoud Abbas, because he did not want to be part of any agreement that had Hamas as a party. I think he was convinced that if he did so, he would be punished for it by the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans. And this directly, in my view, led to the events that we've been witnessing the past 2 years. The complete marginalization of the Palestinians and of Hamas in particular. The blockade that was imposed on the Gaza Strip beginning in 2005, 2006. The idea that you can the idea that you can achieve security and stability in the Middle East, not by addressing Palestinian rights and grievances, but precisely by ignoring them because they had become a marginal and irrelevant factor, led within the Hamas leadership to this belief that action needed to be undertaken to irreversibly shatter the status quo, locally, regionally, and internationally. It is in that context, I believe, that we need to understand why and how Hamas planned and launched the attacks of October 2023. And just looking at the clock, in conclusion, the question then becomes, what does this mean for the future of the national movement? Is there a future for the Palestinian National Movement? If there is it going to be in any way resembling what has come before it? Well, I think the survival of the Palestinian National Movement depends entirely on the ability of its constituent elements to reach a national consensus. In other words, if we continue with a situation in which each faction independently feels it has the authority to take national decisions about war, about peace, about negotiations, about regional and international alliances, you will see each of them basically disintegrate to the point of being repudiated by their own constituents. You already see that with Fatah. Fatah today is a movement that exists in name only. It is in an advanced state of disintegration. And it's very much a question whether there is even going to be a transition after Mahmoud Abbas departs or is removed from the scene, because there isn't going to be a consensus about his successor the way we had in 2004, 2005 after Arafat. As far as Hamas is concerned, there are very similar questions. There needs to be a reckoning with the decisions that it took and the consequences that these have had. Have they impacted positively or negatively on the struggle for Palestinian self-determination? If so, how? If not, why not? And what lessons need to be learned? And what we've seen in each of these crises that the Palestinians faced after Black September, after the siege of Beirut, after the Second Intifada, is that there has never been a proper assessment and evaluation and reckoning with where Palestinians have succeeded, where they have failed, and how they need to then adapt for their future. And this is not only an essential opportunity to do so, but it may well be the last one for the national movement as we have known it in recent decades. Thank you very much.
Dear Mouin, thank you very much for this very insightful and thought-provoking lecture. And I think the moment has come to open the floor to the audience. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to collect maybe 3 questions for the first round and then move on from there. Just a second, someone will be walking around with a microphone.
I see one back there.
Hi. So, like a 2-part question. Mouin, do you see a resolution to the Palestinian issue outside of a pan-Arab approach? I know that the Arabs have the Palestinians down many times, but do you see a resolution to that outside of it? Can the Palestinians, do it on their own? And the second part is, during Thursday, the question of like 1-state, 2-state solution was asked, and I'd love if you can elaborate on what you said then of the 2-state solution being attainable but not desirable to you, and why wouldn't a 1-state solution, or as one Palestinian anarchist whose name escapes me said, no state solution. Like, I'd love if you can elaborate on that.
Up to you. Yeah, should I answer? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this lecture. My question is related to, I think, primarily to if you could say something about also civil society and like the long tradition of non-violent resistance that's been part of the Palestinian National Movement. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's very a long and symbolic, inspirational struggle. That's been, I was part of the ISM, the National Solidarity Movement, for many years, and we took part in protests that were organized by the popular committees very effectively. And at that point, I mean, there was more room for being human shield and so on the West Bank. So yeah, a little bit about civil society and the popular committees, maybe something about the 2018 protests in Gaza, and also maybe the role of Mouin Rabbani. Also,
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question regarding what it means in 2025 to be Palestinian. So we started the lecture with the shaping of the Palestinian identity, then we went to the national movement, but what it means in 2025 to be Palestinian, and I mean by that, what is the statistical Palestinian, like what are the constituents that would be behind any national movement? Are we counting only the people living in Palestine or those also in exile? And because they live under different material conditions, whether they live in the Jordan or in Europe or the US and so on, would they be behind this national movement, and would it defend their interests? They might be interested in the right of return or not, and whatever national movement would emerge would have to answer to the constituents that are behind it. That's my question.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. Let me start with that. Thank you for those questions. Can the Palestinians achieve their rights independently of an Arab approach? Perhaps theoretically possible, but unlikely. And even if it is possible, it's quite clear that Palestinians will be in a much better position to achieve their rights with the support of Arab states, of Arab societies, of Arab political will, of eventually, if necessary, Arab military support. But I think the other interesting thing is that one consequence of the Gaza genocide is that Palestine, to a much greater extent than ever before, has become a global rather than a regional issue. I mean, the genocide case before the International Court of Justice, it wasn't bought by Algeria, it wasn't bought by Jordan, it was bought by South Africa. And we've seen South American states take much more active measures during the past year than any Arab states. If you want to look at it in purely military terms, the only state that has bombed Israel has been Iran, and the Houthis, if you consider them a government as well. So quite clearly, having regional support is absolutely essential. I mean, the fundamental challenge here is that the Israelis are too powerful and the Palestinians too powerless to reach any resolution that achieves Palestinian rights. And I think an energetic Arab position could redress that balance, and hopefully it will. But at the same time, in its absence, we're now, I think, entering a phase where global international support is becoming just as important as regional support. And I've given some examples of that. Now, the question concerned one or two states. Just to repeat what I'd said a few days ago, I'm a former proponent of a two-state settlement, and my position was built on several premises, which is that, first of all, a two-state settlement remains the international consensus, and if you are the by far weaker party, lacking in either significant regional or international support, seeking to achieve your rights, then you would do well to seek at least the implementation of the international consensus. And secondly, that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has never achieved the kinds of legitimacy that similar occupations have achieved. By comparison, Algeria was recognized not as a French colonial possession, but as part of France. And I could give other examples. And on this basis, I believe that Palestinians would do well to pursue a strategy to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses by seeking to achieve a two-state settlement. I've now repudiated my own position, and in hindsight, I perhaps should have been more aware of it. But I don't think there can or should be a settlement with a genocidal apartheid regime. I think it needs to be dismantled. How you go about doing that is of course, an entirely different question. But, and especially now also the occupation has been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice and so on. And I would just like to, in this context, bring up I interviewed Edward Said several times. The last time was about a year before his untimely passing. And as you know, he was perhaps the most prominent advocate of a two-state settlement. If you read his 1978 book, The Question of Palestine, and the reason that he was so strongly opposed to Oslo at least initially, was not because it would produce the two-state settlement that he was against, but that he felt it would make impossible the two-state settlement that he still supported. And of course, during the 90s, he became a strong advocate for a one-state settlement, for a one-state solution rather than a two-state settlement. And when was it, in 2002, I believe, or perhaps 2001, he had come to Jerusalem for the funeral of his very close comrade, Ibrahim Abu, and I interviewed him and I said, you know, you're now, you've become a proponent of a one-state solution. Does that mean you've renounced the struggle for an end to occupation, for dismantling the settlements, for a Palestinian state and so on? And his response was no, quite to the contrary, that he believed that if Israel was forced to relinquish the occupation and dismantle the settlements, in other words, a two-state settlement as it originally envisaged, you know, a full Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 boundaries rather than keeping half of it and making the rest of it a jigsaw puzzle. He believed that is something that could have a transformative impact on Israeli Jewish society, seeing that they were compelled to dismantle their entire colonial enterprise in the occupied territories, to relinquish all the territories they had occupied in 1967, and that is something that could then lead to the peaceful establishment of a one-state solution. That was in 2002. Is that still the case in 2025? I really don't know. But again, I believe that achieving a two-state settlement is not, you know, I've never believed this idea that there's a mathematical formula where you say if you have X settlements and Y settlers, this percentage or that percentage, it then becomes impossible to end the occupation. Yes, it can become a lot more difficult, but ending the occupation is a matter of political will, not mathematical formulas. And so that's why I believe it remains attainable. If sufficient political will is mobilized, Israel can be quite easily, I think, forced to relinquish its occupation, and you could get the establishment of a genuinely independent and sovereign Palestinian state. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could happen. And the conclusion I've now reached is that even if it is attainable, it has become undesirable for the reasons I gave. Let me just look here. You had asked about Palestinian traditions of nonviolence. Yes, I mean, I gave the example of what was at the time the longest general strike in recorded history, from April to October 1936, which, you know, is by definition nonviolent. I mean, for the past several years, excuse me, certainly before October 7th, all the debate and discussion in Europe has been about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Well, what could possibly be more nonviolent than not buying something, you know, or refusing to sell something, or not making an investment? But, you know, when you're talking about Palestinians, anything they do in support of their rights is illegitimate and criminal and terrorist. So if you refuse to buy a Jaffa orange, that means you're a Nazi. You know, if you refuse to participate in a certain bank or investment fund or whatever because of its relations with the Israeli military, well, that makes you a jihadist. And this, I had I had a discussion with a diplomat many years ago when I was with the International Crisis Group, and he felt the need to start lecturing me about the need for the Palestinians to embrace nonviolence. And so I said, okay, can you name me one nonviolent tactic or strategy that your government is prepared to publicly support? And I got this kind of blank stare, because the issue has never been about rejection of Palestinian armed resistance. The issue is a rejection of any Palestinian opposition to anything Israel does, whether it's violent, non-violent, peaceful, non-peaceful. There is this attitude that Palestinians have no right to resist Israel, and anything they do to resist Israel is considered illegitimate. How else could you possibly explain all these efforts to criminalize and delegitimize BDS activity, to get people fired from their jobs for supporting Palestinian rights or opposing the Gaza genocide? There's simply no other explanation. But to get back to your question, yes, that was one example. There is a whole tradition of nonviolent resistance in the occupied territories after 1967 within Israel since 1948. I will say that on the whole, the Palestinians have not made conscious choices between violent and non-violent forms of resistance, but have tended to engage in the whole spectrum of resistance activities. Although, of course, you also asked about civil society organizations, and when you look at labor unions, the women's movement, and so on, those have played an absolutely crucial role in mobilizing Palestinian society around various issues. I mean, you have, for example, the campaigns against the construction and expansion of the West Bank Wall. Unless you consider throwing a stone the equivalent of unleashing an Air Force raid, that was quintessentially nonviolent campaign. And you had also asked about Marwan Barghouti. Well, it's a very interesting question. I think regardless of reality, he is seen as someone, perhaps one of the very few current Palestinian leaders, who is capable of unifying the Palestinian people under one agenda. And I think that explains why Israel has been so opposed to releasing him. And by the way, it's not only Israel. Mahmoud Abbas is just as opposed to Marwan Barghouti's release from prison. And I'm not just making that rhetorical point. Marwan Barghouti's wife, Fadwa, has said as much over the years, that there was one point many years ago where I think it was still the George W. Bush administration had given some indications that it might be proposing that Israel release Marwan Barghouti, and there were persistent reports that the Palestinian Authority leadership was lobbying the Israelis not to do so, and since then there have been similar incidents. So could he unify the Palestinians around a single agenda? Well, he is known as someone who has supported power sharing with Hamas, who has supported cooperation with Hamas, and that he feels this is necessary both for the Palestinian National Movement and actually for the rejuvenation of the Fatah movement. And I think there are probably very few people currently who could play that role. You asked, was it you? Thank you. What does it mean to be Palestinian? Well, I think, you know, we were approaching a stage some years ago where Palestinians were in danger of becoming a collection of politically insignificant demographic communities scattered primarily around the Levant, with no political agency, with you know, had basically become irrelevant. I think that's now completely changed. I think the challenge is, how do you reconstitute the Palestinians as a people institutionally? Yes, you still have the PLO, and yes, the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, but it's a shell. It's an empty shell. And what is required is to find a formula whereby you have genuinely nationally representative Palestinian leadership that is seen to represent all Palestinians and not just those in Gaza or the West Bank or Lebanon or whatever. Now, my own view, I have consistently been against elections. First of all, I don't think it makes sense to have Palestinian elections that are limited to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That's number one. Those aren't national elections. Those are regional or provincial elections. Second of all, you can't have Palestinian elections. If you hold elections everywhere where Palestinians live, most Palestinians in Jordan, who are also Jordanian citizens, are not going to vote for clear reasons, and in other cases that could be the same. And anyway, you know, look at this country. Germany is a properly functioning democratic society. Well, what do elections do? They divide winners from losers. Okay, when you have elections, the party that wins gets all the power, gets all the office, and the party that loses sits on the sidelines and is excluded and hopes it wins the next election. Well, that makes sense in a properly sovereign functioning state. That doesn't make sense during a phase of national liberation. What you need is national consensus. What you need is decision making in which everyone participates, not only those with the most votes. And that's why I think, you know, the quota system is far from ideal, but it has its advantages. And the irony is, if you look back over Palestinian history, you know, the PLO and its factions and its leaders, whether Arafat or Habash or whoever, achieved the zenith of their legitimacy and popularity before Oslo. Arafat became much less popular and much less legitimate after he was elected president of the Palestinian Authority in 1996. Because, you know, that's not how legitimacy and credibility are determined. So, to get back to your question, what constitutes the Palestinian people? I would say all of us, but the real question isn't what constitutes a people, but how do you reconstitute properly representative, credible national institutions that are able to act on behalf of the entirety of the Palestinian people? I think that was all the questions.
Thanks, Mouin. I would like to go back to the historical introduction you gave. I'm here.
There you are.
because you already took down one of those Zionist myths, maybe you can take down another. It's a quite annoying question, at least to me, when it's asked to me. So, but I think we are in Germany, and German propaganda is Zionist propaganda too. So maybe it's good to talk about this. So can you maybe speak about the role of the Grand Mufti in the early national Palestinian movement?
Thank you, Mr. Rabbani, for your lecture. I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to hear you right now. I still remember a discussion with you and the Israeli historical Maurice, Ben Maurice, and was also Finkelstein.
Yes.
And he was like, you were both arguing that he was seen as the Palestinians who were never really to give a serious proposition for a settlement, and you were countering with that it was, for you, you said that the most realistic historical point was the settlement or agreement about the 1967 borders, knowing that all the Palestinian, all the essential political parties, Palestinian side, were actually saying yes to this borders, with also Hamas. Hamas in the new charter also said that it is okay with that. And you mean that it was the most historical, realistic solution for the two-state proposition. Can you, and you didn't have time to elaborate more because it was conversation wasn't that really easy. Can you elaborate more? Do you still think it was historically the most realistic one?
Mm-hmm.
And do you think also it will be the 67 borders?
Mm-hmm.
And I have the second question, if it is not, do you think that in the future the scenario of South Africa apartheid will repeat?
Mm-hmm.
As Ilan Pape said,
Mm-hmm.
he said that the Zionist project is in the fall now because internationally it can't be the same as now. It kind of continues in this 25 years or 50 years. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I would like to ask a question about the people, really. If it's a national liberation movement, but it's a liberation of the people, and there are two people involved. I mean, one of them I think, sorry. So what I'm wondering, if we are talking about one state, how can one even right now envisage that? Probably not, but how could the two people work together? Like the people,
Yes.
people, not the state,
Yes.
but the people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have ideas on that, or is it
Mm-hmm.
too, I don't know, too soon to think
Mm-hmm.
in that way?
Yeah. Thank you. You had asked about the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was from one of the more prominent Jerusalem families, was appointed by the British to the position of Mufti, which I believe is a position that was created under the British mandates, although I could be wrong on that. And he was essentially appointed because he was seen by the British as someone they could work with, and he had convinced them he was someone they could work with, and he was someone they could work with. And there were various accusations made about him in the 1920s and early 30s that he was somehow inciting Palestinians to rebel against the British and the Zionists, none of which are substantiated. And this is a key point because as in other colonial situations, the way it's presented is not only do the Palestinians not have any legitimate grievances. They're not even aware that they're being colonized. You know, they're these empty shells just happily picking fruit and vegetables in the sunshine. And it's only when these diabolical figures like Haj Amin al-Husseini or, you know, whoever show up and start inciting them that they begin making trouble. It's you know, it's the way it's always been presented. Of you have these simple peasants who, you know, only want to plow the fields and dance around the campfire or whatever, and don't even know their rights are being violated or that they have legitimate rights, and therefore you need to deal with people like Haj Amin al-Husseini. Well, Haj Amin al-Husseini had become a national leader, and he did become a leader during the 1936 rebellion, but the evidence suggests that it was less a situation of him leading and inciting a rebellion as being pulled into it by the forces in Palestine. In other words, that he saw it as being given a choice of either joining the rebellion in order to maintain his leadership position or losing it by refusing to do so. Well, he is of course best known for having, I can't quite remember, the British arrested him and deported him and he escaped, or he managed to escape before the British were able to arrest him, and he then went to Lebanon and to Iraq and ended up here in this city seeking the support of your government during the Second World War. And I should add, he was not the only one. There was quite a few cases in India, for example, of people seeking the support of fascist regimes against the British and the French. Now, in Haj Amin's case, it is of course, the case has added significance because he was not just seeking, you know, German arms to fight the French, but this was in the context, of course, of the Holocaust and of Zionism, the Zionist program seeking to transform Palestine into a Jewish state. And so, while Haj Amin on the one hand was seeking German support for the fight against the British and the Zionists, Hitler and the Nazi regime here was seeking to exploit him as kind of a Muslim figurehead who it could use to incite against the British and the Muslim world and to, promote its anti-Semitic messaging and so on. And all the indications is that he cooperated with the Nazis in the hope of getting significant support in exchange, and that support never really came. I think he was at one point deployed to Bosnia to try to recruit Bosnian Muslims to join the German military. But the interesting thing is that, you know, so yes, you know, he did play a role during the Second World War, one that I don't think anyone who looks at it can say that he acquitted himself well, and that it is a role one should be proud of. Quite the contrary. Yet for some reason, well, we know why the reason is. You then had Netanyahu about 10 years ago, as some of you may have seen, in a press conference, basically saying that Hitler never really thought of the Holocaust, hadn't occurred to him to launch a campaign of extermination against the Jews of Europe until he was persuaded to do so by Haj Amin al-Husseini. You know, now, imagine if anyone else had said that no, it wasn't Hitler's idea. You know, he had to be talked into it. If anyone else had said that, you know what would happen to them. You know, but when an Israeli leader says it, it's somehow legitimate. And the other, you know, so there's this kind of vast, what do you call it, expansion of his role as if he was somehow a central figure in the Holocaust. And there are, you know, false reports that he went with Himmler, I think, to Auschwitz, and perhaps some people have probably written articles about how he personally operated the gas chambers and so on. Yes, you know, Haj Amin al-Husseini was motivated by a desire to seek the support of the enemies of his enemies. The Germans saw in him a valuable, potentially valuable collaborator in order to spread their message against their enemies, and of course as part of their Nazi ideology, and that should be judged on its own terms, even as we can also say that it didn't really amount to very much. But to then, as part of a propaganda exercise, basically say the Holocaust originated in the mind of Haj Amin al-Husseini and not Adolf Hitler seems to be just a tad excessive. Regarding Benny Morris, the point he was making was that the real issue is that Palestinians have never genuinely accepted the existence of an Israeli state, and that all these things, you know, Arafat's recognition of Israel, all the statements of recognition they have made, all the instruments of recognition they made, have been fundamentally insincere and can't be trusted. And he doesn't really give a reason for this, except to say it was propaganda and so on. And I was talking about this with Norman Finkelstein later, trying to figure out what, you know, why is, I don't think he was saying it just as a kind of propaganda exercise in the context of our discussion. I think what it ultimately comes down to is he refuses to believe that any Palestinian was actually genuinely prepared to accept a Palestinian state on only 22% of what had been mandatory Palestine. Perhaps he doesn't think they should accept it. Perhaps he thinks that if the roles were reversed, he would never accept it. So he finds it impossible to believe that any Palestinian was prepared to accept it. Now, without getting into a discussion of whether they should or whether they shouldn't, I mean, a sovereign Palestinian state on 22% of mandatory Palestine was the PLO's national program for decades. It remains it today. And in fact, the parties obstructing it are not the Palestinians, are not the Egyptians, it's the Israelis and the Europeans and the Americans. The Palestinians were never offered a state on 22%. Yes, they were in the 2000s on several occasions offered a state, but it is what the former Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad called the Mickey Mouse state. It wasn't anything approaching the international consensus. I don't know if that was that your question.
I would like to elaborate more on the border, like 67 border. Why it was like the most realistic?
Yes. Well, I'm not 100% certain of the details, but basically, as you know, the 29 November 1947 United Nations General Assembly Partition Resolution allocated something like 53% of mandatory Palestine to a Jewish state. And at the end of the Palestine War in 1949, Israel was in occupation of 78% of mandatory Palestine. And essentially what happened is that the United Nations, the international community, never demanded that Israel withdraw to the partition boundaries. And the boundaries at the end of the Palestine War, even though Israel has never itself proclaimed its borders, the armistice lines of 1949, for all intents and purposes, became Israel's internationally recognized boundaries, whether we like it or not. And the territory that Israel conquered beyond the proposed partition lines were not characterized by the international community as occupied territory. The territories Israel occupied in 1967 have consistently been deemed occupied territory, and according to the International Court of Justice, are now considered illegally occupied territory. So that's the explanation. And excuse me, there was a question about two states and two peoples. I think it was, well, a formula will need to be found. Look, whether you like it or not, there are now, I don't know what it is, 7, 8, 9 million Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs living between the river and the sea, with another, with many millions more Palestinian refugees, many of whom would like to exercise the right of return, all of whom insist on having that right recognized, many of whom may well seek to exercise it. Now, whether you think those Israeli Jews are there by right or have what we might call acquired rights, you can't just say, get on a ship or a plane and go back to Poland or Yemen or whatever. That would be fundamentally immoral and unethical. But a formula has to be found to guarantee equality on an individual and on a communal basis. I think at least initially you're going to have to find a formula where you have individual equality, in other words, a kind of one person, one vote system, but also additional protections so that the two communities can, that their collective rights will not be, will not be subjugated by the other or by the state. It's not something I've thought about very deeply in terms of specifics, but I'm sure there are multiple formulas for reaching such a solution. Is it the case, that many Israeli Jews will choose not to live in a society where they will only be equal citizens rather than privileged ones? Perhaps. Is it the case that many Palestinian refugees who have put down firm roots outside of Palestine will choose not to exercise a right of return? Perhaps, but I think we need to proceed with the assumption that those who are currently there and those who have a right to be there need to have their rights guaranteed and need to have an equality of rights guaranteed, and that at least for the initial phase, this concerns not only individual rights, but also collective rights. I Thank you.
Hi, Mouin. Thanks a lot for speaking so eloquently tonight. I have two very quick questions. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the fate of Hamas, or what's left of them? So do you think what role will they play in the future, especially with regards to the national movement? And maybe also like the sort of Islamist element that could play for the future of the nationalist movement. And the second question is a little bit about the role of diaspora. Whether you think that if you think towards the end of your lecture you talked about the need for the reconstitution of the nationalist movement, whether you think that should take place inside Palestine, so in the West Bank or in Gaza, or whether it has to take place somewhere in exile. Like as you said, during different periods in history, it was Beirut,
Yes.
it was Jordan, Amman. Where do you think this reconstitution needs to take place?
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, I have a question from you regarding your point about the international support of the Palestinian cause and your comment on Iran. I don't know what your stand is on the position of Iran on the Palestinian cause and the support of that. But I want to explicitly ask you what your stance on the support of Iran and the Palestine is, and then if you are pro that, or your evaluation of the people of Palestine regarding this support, like as a positive is. So do you think, is it morally correct that put a blind eye on the origin of this support coming from a kleptocracy, unfunctional states, massively suppressing its own people with high execution rates and all of the things, etc., from you and also for the Palestinian cause in general? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just a brief question, I'm curious what you think. In the context, when we're talking about management of resistance, liberation movements, independence movements were historically more, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, socialist, and we saw that, of course, also in Palestine. But in the context of, let's say, post-Soviet Union and also post-9/11, we saw with Huntington and the Clash of Civilization a gradual shift away from that to a more like of cultures, right? Like culturizing resistance, basically, right? How do you think about this in the context of Palestine?
I'm not sure I understood the question, sorry.
Well, also the Palestine liberation movement was inspired by an internationalist, a socialist, and anti-capitalist ideology, but with the rise of Hamas, like, they fall very nicely into this idea of clash of civilizations. No? So I'm curious what your take is on that. Maybe hashtag also the support for Hamas coming from various actors in Israel at the time. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I think the first question was about the future of Hamas. That was from... Yes. It's a very difficult question to answer. Hamas has done several things in the past 2 years. It undertook an initiative that placed the question of Palestine back at the very center of the international agenda, in a context in which it had been quite successfully removed from the international agenda. I'd like to remind you that the traditional approach had been that when the Palestinians signed Oslo, they weren't under any illusions, or at least Arafat wasn't under the illusion. I think many others were, but Arafat was sufficiently cynical not to be under the illusion that Israel was genuinely interested in forging peace with the Palestinians. The way he understood it is that Israel believed it needed to make peace with the Palestinians in order to unlock the potential of relations with the broader Arab world. In other words, peace with the Palestinians was the price of admission to normalized relations with the Arab world. What we saw happening during the first Trump administration and what Biden was working at was reversing that equation, that you normalized Arab-Israeli relations in order to marginalize the Palestinians and eliminate the question of Palestine and to allow Israel to unilaterally deal with that question, those issues as it saw fit. And what has happened as a result of not only the October 7th attacks, but the Israeli genocide during the past 2 years, is that the question of Palestine is now firmly once again at the very heart of the international agenda and the regional agenda. At the same time, of course, the Gaza Strip has been reduced to rubble. More Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip in the past 2 years than Palestinians have been killed in the entire history of the question of Palestine. And what we don't yet know, and I think it's premature to seek to draw any conclusions, is to what extent Hamas will be given credit for the changes in the perception of the question of Palestine versus be held responsible for the very physical changes in Palestine, if I can put it that way. And much will depend on, there have been two trends within Hamas in recent years. One trend seeks to integrate Hamas into the national movement. In other words, to seek to join the PLO and become a equal member of the PLO, no different than the others. And there's another trend that seeks to replace the national movement and replace the hegemony that Fatah has exercised for so long with the hegemony of its own. And I'm not in a position to make a determination about which of those two trends, let's say, is in the ascendant. To what extent have the events of the last 2 years affected the relative strength of these two trends? Time will tell, and unfortunately, that's the best, as close to an answer to your question as I can come. The second question was, I only managed to write reconstitution. Was that you?
Yeah, it's a little bit about diaspora and exile.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think if you're talking about conferences and parliaments and so on, I don't think those should be held under Israeli occupation. I mean, we already have the experience of several meetings of, for example, the Palestinian National Council or Central Council or Fatah Revolutionary Council, where Israel prevents delegates who are based outside Palestine from attending. And so I think any such meeting should be held, for example, in Algiers and Cairo, wherever. I don't think such meetings can be held under Israeli occupation. At the same time, I think it's important for representatives of all the different communities to participate in those. And that's, I was referring earlier to the quota system. You know, in the 70s and 80s, delegates to the Palestinian National Council would in part be nominated based on where they, so you had representatives of the Palestinians in Lebanon, the Palestinians in Jordan, the Palestinians in Syria, and so on. I think it's very important, even if you have to revert to a partial quota system, to ensure that all the main Palestinian communities are represented. Is that what you were asking? Yes. Yeah, okay. Regarding the question about Iran, I was simply making a factual observation in response to a question about Arab states, that the only state that bombed Israel during the past 2 years was a non-Arab one, Iran, unless you also want to include Yemen in that example. But with respect to your broader question, yes, the Palestinians have been supported by some very unsavory regimes. In fact, every people that has fought for its freedom has been supported by some very unsavory regimes. And if I can give an analogy, Israel wouldn't exist were it not for Joseph Stalin. But that never seems to be an issue by people who spend 24 hours a day, denouncing not only the Soviet Union, but Stalin specifically, to the extent of comparing him to Hitler. But somehow it was okay for him, to ensure that the United Nations supported partition by getting the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc states to vote. And the Soviet Union was the only state that via Czechoslovakia provided arms to Israel during the Palestine War. That seems to never be a problem, but whenever anyone who's not an angel supports the Palestinians, all of a sudden, how dare you take support from this state or that government? Yes, obviously, there are issues with taking support from very unsavory regimes. That's clear as daylight. But I don't think that Palestinians are in a position to be the only people in history fighting their freedom who will demand a certificate of good conduct from anyone who supports them. But I think, I think you raise a legitimate point. Yeah, the last question. Just following on, the previously, of course, the Palestinians were supported by the Soviet bloc. They were supported by the DDR, and others. But the Palestinians, although they viewed themselves as a revolutionary movement, and although they were very much part of, let's say, the Third World revolutionary nationalist movement, the Palestinians never considered themselves to be part of a global socialist or communist revolution. I think it was you who asked the question. Sorry, yeah, they never, even though you had certain elements within the Palestinian National Movement that openly identified themselves as Marxist and identified with this global trend, the national movement as a whole never viewed itself, like, if you were, compared to, for example, the Cubans or the Vietnamese, who openly proclaimed themselves to be socialist revolutionaries and internationalists and so on. That hasn't been the case with the Palestinians even before Hamas. since Hamas, of course, you mentioned Huntington and the clash of civilizations. I think this is more something that is being consistently mobilized by enemies and adversaries of the Palestinians. If you've noticed, particularly during the past 2 years, there has been an effort to erase any distinction between Palestinian and Muslim, so that we're supposed to think that Palestinians are all Muslims and all jihadists, especially the priests and the ones in the churches, of course. But in the context, I think, of let's say, the agenda of the far right in Europe, the growing Islamophobia, and particularly in the aftermath of the September 2001 attacks and so on, there's been a real effort, I think, to identify Palestine as a Muslim rather than a national cause. And, for many it is, of course. But it's ultimately, it's a national cause about national rights. But there has been, and you've seen also, anyone who supports Palestinian rights or opposes the Gaza genocide is denounced as a jihadi, even if they could never qualify to be a jihadi. They're denounced that way anyway. It's one of the favorite pastimes these past years of the group that I like to call the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra. It's one of their favorite concertos. You're a jihadi. This is and that makes it easier for others to kind of delegitimize, dehumanize, denounce.
I have a question regarding to the future of the Palestinian movement. Whether in the ground, now we're seeing West Bank, the control, like it's expanding the settlements, and the Gaza, I'm not sure if it will be back again as it was before or not, but also in a broader perspective, you can note now the shift in the public opinion in US, for example, MAGA movement and in European context. How this could impact positively into the movement? Yeah.
I'm not sure I understood the question, I'm sorry.
So the future of the movement on the ground regarding to what's going on now and in a broader context.
No.
Thank you very much for the lecture and for answering so many various questions. I have two questions regarding the post so-called peace plan, Trump peace plan. We've seen the meeting of various Palestinian fractions in Egypt, and I was wondering how did you perceive that? Because there were talks there of a national consensus, particularly regarding issues of when do we decide to go to war, to peace, or general settlement of the Palestinian question, which was also included in the Hamas response to the Trump deal, which I found very politically clever way of answering of dealing with dealing with the question. And the other question is. There are now internationally two political efforts, at least how I perceive it, tell me if I perceive it wrong, that there is the Saudi, French-led UN path, which falls short of Palestinian expectations maybe, which is not ideal, but at least there is a talk of two-state solution. There are political rights of Palestinians that are being considered. And on the other hand, there's the Trump peace plan, which completely sidelines the Palestinian question and Palestinian political rights. and Arab states are involved in both. What do you make of that? Is this a strategy? Is it simply different opinions of different states, different positions? You mentioned the Abraham Accords before, where Arab states sidelined the Palestinian questions. Are these different positions, or is there a strategy here, or did they just want to stop the genocide and the bloodshed? Thanks.
I have a question regarding Iran, specifically if you think if it has still the capabilities to be a regional hegemon, capable of taking up the Palestinian cause, especially after the collapse of the Assad government and the destruction of the Axis resistance infrastructure in Lebanon and Syria. Also, do you see a possibility of Iran's leadership achieving the political or institutional unity needed to save the national Palestinian movement? Thank you.
Thank you. The first question regarding the future of the movement on the ground, you were referring to the Solidarity movement or to the movement in Palestine? Can you speak up, please? Yeah. I'm not sure how to answer that. Were you referring mainly to the West Bank, for example, or in general? Both. It's very difficult to say. I mean, what I wanted to say in my response to one of the earlier questions is that Palestinians for decades had extremely high rates of political affiliation. In other words, if in the 70s or the 80s you were to do a household survey, almost everyone you would survey would say, I support Fatah, I support the PFLP, I support the Communist Party. That has really changed since Oslo. The largest constituency today is none of the above. Hamas has a stable support base of around 25 to 30%. It can win elections because people will vote against its rivals. Fatah, I would argue, is probably around 40%, but is so internally divided that it can lose elections even when it gets more votes than Hamas, which is in fact what happened in 2006. Hamas won only 40% of the popular vote, but it won because it ran a much more disciplined election campaign. It fielded only one electoral list, whereas Fatah, first Abbas's office, fielded a list of official candidates that a number of people who were upset or disappointed or outraged at being left out composed their own unofficial Fatah lists. And so in a number of cases, the combined votes of the official and the unofficial Fatah lists in fact exceeded the votes of the Hamas list. But the electoral system gives the seat in parliament to the list with the most votes. And that's how Hamas, despite getting less than half the popular vote, got a veto-proof majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council. How did Abbas's office respond? Change the electoral system. But the reason I'm mentioning this is it makes it very difficult to answer your question, because you can't just look at the political positions of the movements in question, because you have so many now who are no longer affiliated with any movements and are either engaged in kind of informal activism or initiatives, or have just taken a position of apathy. In the Gaza Strip, I really don't know if in the next months we're going to see people rallying around the right to remain in the Gaza Strip. Are they going to rally against Hamas if it goes too far in seeking to reassert its hegemony? I don't have an answer to that question. And the reason, and the other one is in the West Bank. We haven't seen a popular uprising against the Palestinian Authority. You know, we know everyone detests Abbas. You know, Netanyahu would probably do better than Abbas in a Palestinian election now. And, you know, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say so. But there has been no popular uprising. There has been no rebellion, even among, you know, the underpaid civil servants and security forces. And this again, I think, reflects a kind of apathy in the West Bank that, you know, we've had two uprisings in the space of several decades, and I suspect a lot of people feel that not only have these not achieved very much, but that they stand to lose even more if they rise up again. And so we're now also, I think, in a situation of flux where you have seen some of these informal initiatives. Some people have suggested, in fact, that what we're seeing is a genesis of a new national movement being formed by these initiatives outside and beyond the scope of the existing organizations and movements that we've been discussing this evening. I don't know enough to say that is a good, an accurate assessment or not. So I'm sorry, I can only tell you I can't really answer your question. Yeah. Huh? About the Cairo meetings? Oh, that I think is of substantial significance. Let's not forget, you know, traditionally the mainstay of support for Israel in the United States was not the conservative Republicans, it was the liberal Democrats. That only began to change with Reden in the 80s and thereafter. Traditionally, you know, the Democrats were seen as the pro-Israeli party, and the Republicans as the less pro-Israeli party, because they were seen as representatives of the oil lobby and relations with conservative Arab governments and so on. But that began to change, and now the most important pro-Israeli constituency in the U.S., it's not the American Jewish community, it's the Christian evangelicals, and it's these MAGA types, and what you're beginning to see now is important fissures, even within the MAGA base. You know, the MAGA base it's a coalition. You know, you have the neocons, you have the Christian Zionists, you have the evangelicals, you have the non-interventionists, and what's interesting is that the way I've understood it, the turning point for much of the Democratic base was the Gaza genocide. For the MAGA base, or at least for those elements of it, who now no longer see Israel as a reliable or valuable ally, but rather see it as a burden, for them the straw that broke the camel's back was the attack on Iran, because they had seen MAGA, you know, America first and so on, and many of them came to the conclusion, or came to the belief, that Israel had successfully manipulated the United States into attacking Iran. And of course, at the time, there were a lot of assessments that it was going to escalate much further than it ultimately did. And now, as you know, some people speak of a civil war within the MAGA base. So it's interesting. There was a question about the Cairo meetings. That was from here, somewhere here, I think. Yeah. Well, there was a meeting between Fatah and Hamas in Beijing last year, and then another one in Cairo. And basically, what Fatah and Hamas agreed was that the post-war, so-called post-war governance of the Gaza Strip would be Palestinian governance, and it would be by a committee of independents, what they call technocrats, who were not formally affiliated with either movement, but would enjoy the consent of both. And Abbas has basically not accepted that agreement, not because he's opposed to the formula that was agreed, but because he doesn't want to be a party of any agreement to which Hamas is a party, which was negotiated with Hamas, because he's worried that this is going to be hurt his relations with the Israelis and the Americans. Now the whole issue is, you have this Blair Witch Project, the Board of Peace, and so on. And the key question is this kind of a second Balfour Declaration, where you have a kind of international mandate, or is it going to be Palestinian governance in the Gaza Strip? Is the Gaza Strip going to be dealt with as a territory that is entirely separate from the West Bank, or will they remain, for political and administrative purposes, one indivisible territorial unit? And the Americans, and especially the Israelis, are pushing very hard for this separation, while the Palestinians are insisting that Palestinian governance is something to be decided by Palestinians, and that it has to be that any separate administration of the Gaza Strip has to be transitional and be integrated once again with that in the West Bank. And you also asked about the UN plans. Well, the Americans are now, it appears, on the verge of getting the Security Council to formally endorse the Trump initiative. What that will mean in practice is difficult to say, because the Americans are counting on a number of Arab states to provide the funding, and a number of Arab and Muslim states to provide the troops for Gaza. But they have made clear, so on the one hand, they're not prepared to reject the Trump proposal in public, but they have also made clear that unless this is part of a credible political initiative, they're not going to get involved. We'll have to see to what extent that turns out to be the case. And there was a final question on Iran. I don't think Iran was ever in a position to be a regional hegemon. And I think it's in less of a position to do so now. What I do think has changed is that Iran, for at least the past decade, has been seen as the main threat by the conservative Gulf states. And these governments also saw Israel as a valued partner and security partner in the rivalry with Iran. And now they see, on the one hand, first they saw a United States that is unwilling to defend them against Iran, and that explains the whole series of normalizations you saw between the Emirates and Saudi Arabia with Iran, for example, in recent years. Now they also see a weakened Iran as a result of attacks on both Iran and it's the overthrow, the ouster of the Assad regime, and the attacks on Hezbollah and so on. While at the same time, they now see Israel as a growing threat. It's seen as, the regional arsonist, the pyromaniac, who's being given an endless supply of matches and kerosene by the Americans. And for them, the Israeli bombing of Qatar was the turning point. So, there's no love lost between them and Tehran, but I think increasingly they see Israel as a bigger threat to their national security.
I fear this brings our time to an end. Thank you very much for sharing all of these insights and thoughts with us, and I'm sure they will stay with us and continue to spark discussions and debates, at least I hope so. I would like to take this moment and thank Boom for providing this physical space, but also thank the organizing team of Zeit zu Reden for providing this discursive space, sorry, it's a bit late. That sustains critical reflections and discussions. And thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Before you rush to your Saturday evening engagements, I would just like to draw your attention to the stand that is outside. If you can, you may donate money and you can support directly families in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Thank you.